Hello, everybody. My name is Natalie Yeadon. I'm the co-founder and CEO with Impetus Digital. At Impetus Digital, we have built some of the best-in-class asynchronous and synchronous virtual collaboration and communication tools. We have worked with life science companies from across the globe over the past 14 years to help them with everything from virtual advisory boards, online medical education, digital investigator working groups. And since the launch of our award-winning Insight Events platform, we've also been helping pharmaceutical companies with global corporate events, MSL and sales rep training, innovation hackathons, and all kinds of other really creative things. But more importantly, at Impetus, we really believe that everything starts with a conversation. And from these big, hairy, audacious conversations with some of the leading edge thinkers, the digital provocateurs, and some of these, healthcare thought leaders, we can all work together to collectively and positively disrupt healthcare. And I'm really excited that we have one of these healthcare thought leaders at the table with me today. And this is actually Dr. Pam Ventola. She's actually the Senior Science Director at Cogstate, as well as the Assistant Professor at the Yale Child Study Center. With over 20 years experience, Dr. Ventola leads Cogstate's rare disease and pediatric portfolio, providing strategic oversight and expert guidance throughout all stages of the clinical trial planning and execution process. Pam has supported international trials from across a wide range of phases and indications. As a licensed clinical psychologist, her primary clinical expertise is in pediatric neuropsychology, specifically developmental and genetic disorders. She received her PhD in clinical psychology from the University of Connecticut and completed her clinical training and postdoctoral fellowship at the Yale University School of Medicine. She serves on the editorial review board of multiple academic journals and has approximately 200 related publications and presentations, including a book on diagnostic assessment. Welcome, Dr. Ventola. So happy to have you on the show today.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here.
Absolutely. What a stunning background and full of all kinds of bells and whistles. I was wondering if you could maybe start off the show explaining a little bit about your professional journey, sort of starting off basically from academia and moving from clinical practice to joining Cogstate as the Senior Science Director. Tell us a little bit about that journey.
Sure thing. So, I started my training. I did a lot of clinical work. I did research in autism, so in autism spectrum disorders, starting looking at the early diagnosis and identification of autism spectrum disorders. And then at Yale, I was trained more globally in a variety of different developmental disabilities, genetic syndromes, rare diseases. And my academic research turned to clinical trials. So in my academic lab, we work on behavioral treatments for individuals with autism spectrum disorders, and we look at the biological markers of treatment response. So we do fMRI, eye tracking, EEG with these children to see if we can see brain changes as their behavior changes, with the idea of looking at early efficacy indicators. Can we see from the brain if the child's kind of moving on the right trajectory or not? And by looking at these brain markers, we can also have a better understanding of what areas of focus from like a biological perspective we can kind of hone in on to help support their development. So I did that for 15 years. And I also see a lot of patients clinically through our clinical practice who have a range of different developmental disabilities. And then I also started working at Cogstate, and Yale Child Study Center and Cogstate formed a partnership to support pharmaceutical sponsors on their trials in pediatrics and in rare diseases. So at this point, I still have an academic lab, I still see patients, but I also do a lot of work with industry sponsors, helping them with protocol development, choosing endpoints that are feasible and also sensitive with these, children and adults with rare diseases who often have very significant impairments, either cognitive impairments, language impairments, motor impairments. So the measures we pick need to be very kind of sensitive and specific to that indication. So I do a lot of work with that now too.
Beautiful. So let's actually talk a little bit, since we're really talking about Cogstate here, is what attracted you to that company, and what specifically are they doing in general around mental health, mental conditions, and the use of technology?
So what attracted me there was really the innovation and the scientific rigor. I really enjoy working with a variety of different pharmaceutical sponsors across a variety of different related but different indications, and helping them problem solve situations and trials that are novel and groundbreaking, and no one's ever done them before, because these rare diseases, there might be just a couple hundred people in the world that has this indication, so we're kind of figuring it out as we go along. So it's really challenging and interesting. And then Cogstate also involves our technology, so we have computerized based assessments to measure different aspects of cognition. In my field, these can be used sometimes. So you need somewhat higher functioning individuals who can understand the task demands. And in rare disease, that's some of our indications. Some of our indications that individuals are too impaired and we need to do other kinds of things to assess them. But with the computerized testing, it is widely relevant. And we have tests measuring constructs such as speed of processing, attention, memory, and they're very, very sensitive measures and can be done in the home. They can be done in the clinic, and most importantly, they're culturally neutral and do not need a professional to administer them. So unlike some of our like complex neuropsychological assessments where you need like a licensed psychologist to do them, these computerized assessments can be done really by anyone. So we look at our research assistants, our study coordinators. Some trials have home-based nursing, so that person can help. Even a study partner, so as a spouse, a caregiver, can administer them as well.
So one of the key things that Cogstate assists with is life science companies wanting to conduct clinical trials for a myriad of different therapeutic areas, but one of the endpoints might be cognitive function, understanding, cognition, et cetera. And that's really, you have established technology types of fun tests that anybody can kind of administer to be able to almost like patient reported outcomes. So tell us a little bit about, if I was a pharmaceutical company and I'm starting to endeavor in one of these clinical trials, tell us what the steps are for partnering and working with Cogstate.
So you reach out to me. We'd have a conversation. We would talk about what your indication is. So who are the subjects? What is their cognitive profile? In these kinds of indications, the behavioral profile is really important too. What are the comorbid conditions? Like, are there motor impairments? Like, we need to be aware of that when picking our endpoints. And then we need to think about your mechanism of action. What are you trying to change? So then we can think about what has been done before. In rare disease, it's usually very little. So we can look at related indications, kind of related trials, to pull on prior work, to kind of form our thinking. And then we sort of determine what kind of assessments do we need. Do we need assessments that are directly completed with the patient? Do we rely on caregiver reported or clinician reported? Based on what you're trying to change and the functioning level of the individual. And with that, sometimes we also develop in collaboration some indication-specific outcome measures. And I do a lot of work in that, where we're adapting and modifying existing tools to make them relevant and more specific to the indications that you're working with. And then kind of get to that point. And then if we decide the best interest in your trial, for your work is direct assessments with the patient, we figure out what those are. A lot of times there are developmental assessments. We have the Bailey, for example, it's commonly used. We have some Wechsler scales. We have a host of different published tests available to us. And some sponsors also choose to instead or an augment computerized battery. And then we talk through the Cogstate battery of what tests we have and what would be most appropriate for that trial.
So in some ways, does Cogstate work almost like a clinical trial consultant, helping companies to develop their clinical trials?
It's exactly what we do. And then once we get to that stage where your protocol's set, your endpoints are selected, we then take it. So that's our initial work. And then we take it to completion. So we train your clinicians on how to use these assessments. We can support the licensing and permissions requirements for the different assessments. We can be involved in your data analysis. And I myself am involved usually with your SAP and then interpretation of your data at the end of the trial.
So where does all the other, I mean, let's just sort of step back here. We realize that COVID-19 has changed the world and the dynamics around clinical trials. We hear a lot about real world evidence. We hear a lot around decentralized clinical trials or hybrid trials. There was literally a moratorium on the way trials were done prior to COVID. And then obviously the world turned upside down since the pandemic. So I was just curious, you hear a lot of things like ECOA and electronic, contracts that patients are filling out. What have you done or are you doing to really facilitate the process so it's much less cumbersome and easier for people to conduct and enroll in these trials?
Yeah. I think it has been the best thing that has happened to pediatrics and rare disease trials, because moving from point A to point B when you have a child, period, or when you have a child who has a high level of a disability is extremely hard. So even going to a hospital or a clinic that once you get there, it's set up for you, but the getting there is really hard, navigating the parking garage, walking through the crosswalks, elevators, etc. I mean, it's a huge burden for these families. So minimizing the time in the clinic and the number of times they have to go to the clinic is huge. It's going to keep people in your trials and want people to enroll in your trials. And what we're doing is, we're facilitating all of that, because I cannot believe in that model more strongly. So we're supporting sponsors in conducting as many assessments as possible remotely. So interviews, they can all be done remotely. Caregiver reported PRO kind of scales, they can all be done remotely. Specifically, one of the things that we're doing is offering central raters. So we have a team of neuropsychologists and other professionals who can conduct these interviews remotely with your caregivers while they're at home, or while their child's at school, or while they're, if it's, an adult or otherwise sort of engaged, they can do it in the evenings, on the weekends. So it makes it much more like caregiver friendly. And by the use of these central raters, you're decreasing your variance. So we can have a very small team of raters collecting your data versus having, one or two or three people per site times your number of sites. It just inherently, that increases your variance that way. So by having it done remotely, it also lends itself really nicely to the use of central raters. Yeah.
So what is Cogstate doing around clinical trial sites? We've obviously all heard around the idea of clinical, key opinion leaders. They've often been the big influencers happening in the IRL conferences and publications and presentations, and we all want them to be part of our advisory boards and our key investigators. They can only go so far and can spread themselves so thin. But now in the world of digital, we're now seeing the emergence of digital opinion leaders, sometimes just as influential, but maybe not as published, or they might be in a more underserved or underprivileged area and representing a different kind of population. How has Cogstate leveraged DOLs or digital opinion leaders and are sort of informing pharma of where some of these clinical sites could be outside of the traditional?
That's such a great question. Yeah, absolutely. And many of our, advisors are global. Cogstate is a global company, to begin with. We have offices, around the world, but then our advisors are spread even, further. And then in addition to our advisors, directly with sites, We have a global network of about 200 individuals worldwide who speak the local languages of the sites. So there are neuropsychologists who are are located in, all across the globe and speak the languages that the sites speak. So they can talk directly to the raters at the site. Whereas I can talk to the ones who speak English, but we have sites all across Europe and in Asia. And we have our global team of consultants who can work directly with the sites, who themselves are key opinion leaders in their local countries as well, and can just know the culture and the language.
Oh, it is absolutely essential. And it sounds like a really great way for, especially for startups. I mean, we always think about startups in the tech space, but there's a lot of startups in the biotech area. And these are not blockbuster products, but they are courageous, brave, companies, groups of individuals who are wanting to sort of do something of significance, and they're getting involved in some of these rare disorder areas. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of them may not have the internal know-how or the experience. And so it's really neat to see that companies like the Cogstates are out there to be able to kind of lead people along the garden path to getting into some of these clinical trials. So I was just curious, as you're helping these companies, small or big, navigating the space around rare diseases, we're also thinking about, all kinds of other therapeutic areas. What are some of the concern areas or the watch out areas that you have found in this process, or some of the things that you like to bring to people's attention, or that you kind of got stuck in, some of the things for people to watch out?
Yeah, there's a couple, and we're learning as we go along. True. But one of the things that I like to bring to sponsors' attention is the rare disease guidance that came from the FDA. So it's about 2 years old, 2.5 years old now. But in that guidance document, they talk about two things. One, getting input from key stakeholders. So key opinion leaders, clinicians, and caregivers in informing what matters to these individuals, what we should be aiming to change, and what we should be measuring in our trials. And then along with that, the importance of indication-specific outcome measures in rare disease, because often what we're finding is, these children, these families, that small changes make a big difference on quality of life. So it might be an incremental change on a scale in terms of like global functioning, but even that incremental change is highly meaningful. So we need outcome measures that are going to detect that level of change. And many of the published scales are in broad strokes. Like, you have to make a lot of progress to kind of move a point on a lot of these scales. And that's where the field is right now, not always realistic. That's where we hope to get. But right now, that's not where we are. And it doesn't mean that your treatment or your compound isn't working if it's not detecting a change on these broad strokes measures. It just means that we need different measures.
So talking about that, so talking about that really important point around traditional clinical endpoints and the ones that we've always used forever and a day. And now we're starting to talk about what is new and what can be more effective. Tell us a little bit around the tenacity around that, or why it's difficult to get people to start thinking about this and thinking about clinical trials differently, even this idea around real world evidence versus phase 3s. Tell us a little bit about some of the legacy thinking and why we're kind of have some sticking points around these big dramatic changes.
Because you never want to be first in a clinical trial. You just don't. You don't want to be the first one to take something to the regulators because it's not proven. And you already have a compound that's not proven. So why would you have an outcome measure that's not proven? Yet we have to kind of take a leap with some of these rare diseases and adapt our measures, or we're never going to detect change. And sponsors are doing that. The regulators are encouraging it and allowing it, supporting it. So we're seeing it more and more. But it's different than where we were 10 years ago, and it's sort of getting out of the comfort zone.
And with regulators encouraging sponsors to go out to speak to patients, caregivers, asking their opinion, asking their feedback on endpoints, what are we sort of seeing some of the feedback coming back? Are they dramatically different than the endpoints that we're traditionally measuring on the efficacy and safety of traditional products?
I think they're more specific. So they're saying this is what matters to us who have, children with this disease. And it might be different than what we were really thinking, but they really give the concrete examples. Communication, attention, might be sleep, or there's some instances where we think like an Angelman syndrome. It's a disorder where sleep is highly disrupted. As an outsider looking in, I would think that's the number one concern, but families tend to say it's not. I mean, some families do. I don't mean to discount that, but they sort of adapt that and make it work, make the sleep part work. So what they really want is, their child to talk more or engage more or walk more smoothly, something like that. And we need to talk to these, stakeholders to kind of get that.
So you were actually mentioning that you have proprietary software, you have proprietary tools and gadgets and games, getting people to think through so you can start measuring the nuances behind some of these cognitive impairments, understanding, comprehension. I know that you'd mentioned a couple in the healthcare space. One's called Cognigram. The other one I think is Know Now. So I hope I'm pronouncing this. No, probably didn't say that correctly. But there's other sorts of tools. Can you maybe start to explain a little bit about what it is that you have?
Sure. So we have, exactly. I mean, they're tests, they're game-like. We have a large suite of tests available. They all are very specific. So they measure one aspect of cognition. So when you think about cognitive tests, some are very broad, like a test of IQ. It's a very broad concept that has a lot of component parts. That's less helpful in your clinical trial because you might be changing one aspect, but by the time you group it together into a composite, you're going to lose that specificity. Whereas the Cogstate battery, each test is individual, it's independent of each other, and they're very specific. So you might have a test that measures attention or a test that measures working memory or executive functioning. So you build the battery, you can put any number of tests together, they're independent of each other, you take them out, put them in, you don't have to take the whole suite. So it's based on the age of the individual and what you're trying to measure. And they're quick. So each test is a couple of minutes. So, you can put 4 or 5 together and might be, for example, 20 minutes, your whole battery. And they're fun. I work with kids. The kids find them fun. They're on a Chromebook. It's a touchscreen. It feels like they're playing a game. Some of them involve like playing cards. Some of them are mazes, but they're designed to be game-like.
Now, the whole ecosystem around clinical trials has changed. So again, the pandemic being a little bit of that tipping point, and there's been this groundswell of momentum around all these changes, including, we said very succinctly, the endpoints are changing, going away from traditional things to these patient-reported outcomes, using everything from ambient biometrics to these assessment tools that you're suggesting. Now, it also changes the dynamics about the tools that we're sending to individuals to input this data. Tell us a little bit about the logistics of sending 24-hour glucose monitors or smartwatches to, the tools you're using. What is that like, and how do these tools get to the end user?
So that's a great question. And it varies based on the trial. So if you're working with adults, even if they have cognitive impairment, if they have a study partner, some of these tests can be done at home with their study partner. There is logistics. You send them, they can use their own device sometimes. Some trials will allow the subject and the caregiver to use their own computer. It's software, it's a website. It's completely fine. Other trials, so with kids, I'm hesitant with that. I prefer, our impaired kids, they have devices that they use for other purposes, like watching their videos, maybe even for communication. So I generally prefer they don't use their own device to do the tests, that they use a provisioned device that we send to them. And then sometimes, depending on the child's functioning level, they do need someone that's not their mom or their caregiver with them to kind of comply and do this. Other kids, if they're higher functioning, better behaviorally regulated, they can have, their caregiver, say it's time to sit down and do the test, and they sit down and do it.
Yeah. So I guess I'm just wondering about the stickiness, if you will, of doing a clinical trial with where there is some cognitive dysfunction and other areas, stick to itness. What is the level of completions, if you will, using these kinds of tools and adherence, if you will, and are you finding there higher dropouts, or do they get bored? Do they just can't manage it? What is it like for these kinds of trials with these types of individuals?
There's not a high level of attrition. Part of it, if they're using the Cogstate battery, the burden is pretty low. The tests are short and they're fun. So the kids are pretty motivated to do it, or the adults, they're pretty motivated to do it. There's not a high level of burden. A lot of the decentralized trials, again, it's in their house, it's easy. And then for our peds and our rare disease trials, the families are highly, highly motivated to help their child and or move the field forward, because they're so invested in their child's disability and just moving the science forward.
A lot of work, obviously we're working, we talked a little bit about peds, but there's obviously the aging population that we're dealing with, and the all kinds of cognitive conditions that happen as a result. I'm thinking about things like Parkinson's, and it's not necessarily Parkinson's cognitive, but it's neuropsych. It affects the neuropsychology and the other dynamics. Alzheimer's. I'm thinking even things like schizophrenia, mood disorders, even migraine. Tell us a little bit about how some of your tools can work on clinical studies and investigation in these particular areas.
Absolutely. And that's Cogstate's like bread and butter. I mean, our biggest area is Alzheimer's disease, and our tests are used widely in that field. They're also used in the others, indications you mentioned, like Parkinson's and schizophrenia. And we have different batteries, so almost off the shelf. They can be modified, absolutely, but that have been like tried and true and tested in these long-standing fields. The work in AD has been long-standing. We know what works. We have good outcome measures, so we can take the Cogstate battery and say, this is what's working in AD.
Fantastic. So I guess the other thing as well too, I'm just thinking about other uses. We've talked a lot about caregivers and patients themselves and sponsors and researchers. I'm just curious also about the point of real world evidence. Pharma companies always have a challenge once they do get regulatory approval of products to say, okay, especially as we start talking about reimbursement and public payers contributing on the reimbursement portion of these very expensive products. The idea here comes down to things like outcomes-based agreements and determining risk benefits and what is this, is there going to be an impact in real life, and this sort of ongoing monitoring of are you moving the needle on some of these key indicators. People obviously who are going to be interested in this are people like private payers and other sorts of individuals. I'm just curious about what Cogstate is or will be doing with these types of stakeholders in the future, as you're talking about ongoing monitoring of cognitive conditions.
Yeah, so we do a lot of that related to thinking about quality of life and what's a clinically meaningful difference and what is a meaningful change for these patients. And there's no one answer. And you have to look at the data kind of individually, at least in the trials I'm working at, to say, what changed, how did it change? And a lot of it is dependent on what the families tell us, kind of in a systematic way. But, for that group of, those subjects, what changed, and was it clinically meaningful for you? Did it make a difference on your quality of life? And tying that to our objective endpoints. Because in a lot of our rare disease trials, we don't have a predetermined known, like, what is a clinically meaningful difference on any endpoint. If we change it by 3 points, so what? Does that mean something? So we're in the process of figuring that out right now. I've done some work with a very commonly used, it's an interview they do with caregivers in autism to do that. We was a very large study with different sponsors and academic collaborators, and we determined and published on what we think a clinically meaningful difference is on that tool. But that was a tremendous amount of work in one indication on one tool. So it's not particularly scalable. So we really are kind of tackling it one trial at a time.
Absolutely. And it's really, really tough pioneering work. So good on you. I'm just thinking about projecting forward on the future of this. You talked earlier about having a small cohort of raters that have a specific type of training to reduce the variance between trials and within trials. And I'm just curious, will the future ensue potentially not having real human raters, but would there be kind of like a chat bot, a type of smart algorithm, a machine learned type of tool that does some of this? Is that in the books or in the future?
It's a great question. We have a little bit of my academic work is doing that, working with families and supporting their kids by use of a chatbot. I think it's going to be the right match for some families and not for others. Some of our tools are really sophisticated and require a high level of training and expertise. And then we kind of get into the question of, can they be kind of automatically scored like from video? Can we come up with like a machine learning approach to measure, motor responses on videos and things like that? Maybe. I hope that can kind of be the coding part of it can become automated. There's some work being done with speech recorders and automating output, so communication output. We're not quite there yet. It's work in progress, and who knows what the future will hold. I'm hopeful, but we're not there yet.
And are you seeing similar things with, I hate using this term because it's kind of cliche and it's kind of broad, but the metaverse? We're talking about everything from virtual reality to, headsets and, eye readers and facial tone changes and facial recognition. I mean, is this all part of like much further down the path, or are there clinical trials actually looking at these kinds of technologies?
So again, I've done some of that in my academic work where we're highly exploratory in terms of virtual reality work. We're not there yet. I would not suggest having something like that in a clinical trial yet. I don't think our technology is where it needs to be. It's the feasibility, it's very expensive, it's sort of not really scalable yet either. Hopefully we'll get there. I think there's a need. I think it'll be helpful, but we just need to move in that direction.
So what do you sort of see, I guess, in the medium to longer term around tools and solutions that you might be planning for academic research?
I think one of the biggest pushes more in the short term, but is to continue to keep these patients and their families at home, allow them to participate in trials, allow their endpoints to be kind of woven into their daily lives. And I don't mean like constant tracking. That doesn't really work. It's not really feasible. Nobody likes to do it. And you end up with a tremendous amount of data that's very hard to analyze. I mean more like the decentralized trials and having them do the endpoints while they're sitting at home, whether it's on an COA device, whether it's on a video conference, regardless, just keeping them, kind of at home. And also improving our endpoints, making them more meaningful to those patients. And we're making progress. We've made a lot of progress over the past 5 years in this area, but we're not there. We haven't arrived at these kind of perfect endpoints that I think we will as we refine them and hone them. We're just going to kind of improve our science.
Absolutely love it. I just love what Cogstate is doing around clinical trials, especially around all these really innovative cognition tools and technologies. For anybody who is listening and is interested in connecting, partnering with Cogstate, we please look for Pam's contact details in the show notes below. I'm sure she'll be very happy to speak to you, especially if you have queries around clinical trials, clinical endpoints. She is just a wealth of knowledge. If you enjoyed this conversation, also check out impetusdigital.com. We have these kinds of conversations asynchronously and synchronously with people like sponsors, physicians, allied healthcare providers, payers, and patients. We actually connect through a variety of touch points so that we can move the needle on clinical trial development, protocol amendments, planning around various strategies and tactics in order for you to really start innovating with your product or brand. We would really appreciate if you could like and subscribe to our channel. And please, if you will, anywhere you find your podcast, please leave us some feedback or a review. I want to thank all of you for your time today. And thank you, Pam, for an outstanding conversation.